Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, my guest is an architect at Collective Project and a graduate of the RV College of Architecture. Her name is Neha Harish. She is an avid architectural travel enthusiast, a Carnatic singer, and a basketball player. Neha's passion for culture, history, and material draws her closer to exploring contextual and collectively driven architectural endeavors through travel and art. She is also a co-flaneur at Three Flaneurs, an architectural design and travel collective. She is constantly looking to expand her design sensibilities across multiple scales. Today, she will be presenting her thesis project and then followed by a conversation. Um, Quite an interesting project has been already been featured on multiple platforms, and but this one is going to be slightly different. We're gonna break the structure and see the behind the scenes processes as well, and many other stuff as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to Neha and let's get started.
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks for having me here. And I think even before I start off with the presentation itself, even for the people who will be listening, I'll just keep the entire presentation as such shorter, and so that we can have like a lengthier conversation regarding this.
Sure.
Okay. So just to begin the presentation itself, I think I'd just like to give almost like a background to how I even got to this project, how I was interested in it, and almost what led me to pick this as my topic. And so at large, the project actually addresses the role of placelessness in architecture. And it's not just a word that we dwell upon. We do talk about place and space in architecture, but placelessness is something that we don't usually pick up and talk about as such. So, which is why I think I'd just like to give a small understanding of where I sort of placed myself or situated myself in this situation. So, firstly, we have about 6 months of preparation time for our thesis, and then we have almost another 4 months of time for our actual thesis semester. And I think it's similar to most platforms of architectural education across our country. But this allowed me to one understand where I place myself as one as an architect, and second as just a human with like just interests. So that led me to then looking around and just seeing, and the commonality that I've almost picked up from most of my the people who I was actually doing the studio with is that people always find a very easy connection with the place that they're from, or like their place of upbringing of any sort, right? So here is where I actually sort of broke away from that, because just as on a personal basis, I've just been and grown up in a city, and I didn't find this immediate connection to my native or like the place that I actually hail from. So that almost led me to thinking about what about these people who actually are involved in forced migrations, be it due to political, be it due to natural reasons, any socio-political conflicts, anything. So that then led me to different understandings of even questioning just how people who don't have that immediate social context that they can respond to, then how do they relate to their places of their new dwellings, or and then of course how does architecture then play a role in all of this. And I think the project attempts to address the role of placelessness, but I think anchors itself to human memory. So the question that at large again the project is trying to answer is the architectural implications of almost of a feeling of placelessness and that loss of identity that somebody goes through during these ethnic cleansings. So one of the immediate stories that actually just unraveled while I was doing some of my readings was actually the civil war in Sri Lanka. And this is in the northern parts of Sri Lanka, and it's almost an immediate understanding for us, because not only did these people go through this, they were forced to evacuate their places and then move out of their homes, and one of the new homes that they found, or can at least call as a home right now, is India. So as you go down the project, you almost tend to realize how um, our understanding as architects with relation to spaces can be limited to some people. And another thing that I found out was, whenever you go through any of these tapes or the interviews of the people who are actually who have gone through these difficult situations, is one, you really understand that they don't immediately go to architects or professional aid to find shelter. So it then became a question of, do you then do an immediate response to this in terms of, maybe let's say, a design of a curated shelter, or any of these new designs that we keep seeing in nowadays, where I recently read this article about how they're designing newer shelters without even understanding that people don't actually look for shelters to live in after these situations. They're not interested in living in shelters. It's probably the one thing that makes them feel extremely insecure about the current situation that they're in, their social standing, and many of the ways in which the people around them also look at them. Especially the people who live in such shelters, it's also very, very biased because of the place that they're actually living in. So it then almost became a question to understand, do you then take up this cause, or do you then hold standing upon this, which is much more ethical in many ways. So of course, like, I just wanted to also show just some of the readings. So for the people who are listening, there are these four main books that I actually went through during the entire course of my thesis. And another disclaimer is that I wasn't necessarily an avid reader before this. I didn't pick up a book because I was much more involved in sports while growing up, so I never really had the time to. And the four books, I think the first one was just trying to understand a larger setting of what happens during migrations, and not even dwelling on whether be it forced or just natural, anything, just in terms of migration. So Sanjeev Sanyal's book on the land of the seven rivers was actually really helpful to just understand that. And I think I also really enjoyed it because I just really like history. So I think that is one of the major reasons why I even picked up this book as a starter. And then I transitioned into Edward Ralph's Place and Placelessness. It gives you a very good conjunction of ideologies and genealogies to understand how does a person look at a place, a space, and then how does a person look at a situation when none of these exist. So that was where that book came into play. And the third one is just a collection of essays that I just skimmed through with Bernard Shumi's Architecture and Disjunction. Here, you almost tend to see what role architecture plays in terms of any social or political standing. So it doesn't give you an immediate answer, which is kind of like the nice part about the book. Okay, so the fourth book is actually One Me. It's a graphic novel by Edward and Lindsay Pollock and Benjamin Dix. And this book was actually really helpful in trying to understand what the real situation is, because one of the first questions that was posed in my thesis seminar was actually, how does architecture relate to any sort of political or social conflict, and does it really have a direct solution of sorts for any such event such as this? And I think this book, I'm also going to just show like a few imageries from the book. It's a beautifully illustrated book by Lindsay Pollock, who's actually tried to he's almost brought out these very natural things that you can show only through a sketch or a drawing, and not through words. And it's when we say it's a graphic novel, it's extremely graphic, and I think it's just a quick coffee table read for anybody who wants to just pick it up. So this actually gave me a really good understanding about what these people went through, because you can look at many documentaries that talk of this, yes, but I think the way in which the situations were captured through this book was really, really beautiful. So that is one. And then it also very importantly talks about the topographies almost that are involved in this story of like terror, but also at the end of the day of hope. Because as you can see in all of these drawings, you see the forest in its biggest, in its vibrance. And it's just testament to how nature actually helped at the end of the day for these people. So then, before just moving on, I've just put out a few images of my writings. So as just a designer, as or even as a person who is trying to learn architecture, I find it very very helpful to actually write down the stuff that actually is going on in my head. And most of these thoughts are just put down in terms of just really, really lengthy writings. And this is just like four spreads that I put out, but it's almost an entire book that I used, and I think half of another book where it was really helpful to also situate yourself in this situation, because you are looking at this as an outsider. And the reason why I say that is because finally, when I came down to actually sitting to design, it was very important for me to look at this as exactly that, as an outsider, because I knew that I would be questioned about my stance or my takings on the story, which is why it was important. And then it's also really important to collate almost everything that I was doing in terms of my readings, in terms of almost the immediate history that was related to the story. And of course, I love to sketch, and just a just an outright array of like things that helped inform my design as such. And it's also just trying to understand what these people might have faced, or might have just as an incident, as an emotion. How do you put it down in through a sketch? And probably then is only when I could give it a formal language of sorts. So which is why this was quite important. And so, yeah, finally coming down to the actual project itself, I'll also keep this quite short because, again, like I think there are some other finer details that I'd like to address. So, one was the immediate question of if the entire situation or the entire ethnic cleansing was actually based in and out of Sri Lanka, how is it and why is it necessary to place this outside Sri Lanka? So the site of intervention actually lies in Chennai, abutting the Kuvam River. Um, and as you can see, the relationship between the two countries, as we all know, just the Ram Setu Bridge, and like our epics that are relating to it. But then also it's that immediate connection to people, because if you look back at the history of the space of Lanka and of India, you need to understand that this entire incident was almost a colonial deposition to how the Britishers actually picked up a large number of our occupants in India, and then pushed them over to the northern parts of Sri Lanka, where they worked as plantation workers, where they worked as coffee and tea and rubber plantation workers. And you could categorize them as slaves. That's probably the word that is also used in many of these books. So when you then move a part of your population to another country, and they're the direct descendants of the present day Tamilians in northern Sri Lanka, it then became really important for me to understand, so what happened after this civil war, where people were again pushed back out of that place. So you're almost getting pushed out from one country, and then you also get pushed out of the other country, and nobody over there is willing to accept. So this entire let's say the story almost situates itself in the middle of a civil war between the Sinhalese government and the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. So the LTT and the Sinhalese government were at war. But really, the ramifications of all this entire war was faced by the people who lived through it, and not by the people who were, necessarily fighting it. So then, coming down to what architecture has in as a say in all of this is that when a person was under a constant state of refuge and almost a disjunction in an unknown environment, his or her connection or a solace would lie in the memories of home, and almost that immediate critical need of understanding of that entire situation becomes really important for him, because a lot of people talk about remembering these events and just remembrance, which is what used to confuse me. So what do you do after you remember, and do you dwell on it? Do you then question things? So I think that was my that was my interpretation of my programmatic composition for the entire story. So through the project, I was hoping to actually open up these discourses of tolerance. And when you talk about tolerance, I really like this one quote by Rennie Dubos, which says, "Human diversity is." I think this is what I clearly remember. So if I'm not wrong, it says human diversity is more than a tolerance, is more than a virtue. It makes it almost a requirement for survival, is what he says, and it just struck me so much because how do you induce empathy into humans, and does design and architecture actually allow for that? Was what the question was throughout my thesis. So again, coming back to the project in itself, the project would then place some due consideration over sensitizing these humans towards understanding the story. So that was not my intention, was to not do that in a very direct way, because the minute you tell somebody, this is this, and then this is what the interpretations of all of these could be like, they then tend to almost switch off their brains, just keep that in their understanding, and then never dwell upon it again. So then, um, just relating it back to my project, so the entire program is actually realized in four different aspects. One is recollection, in the form of a museum itself, because as much as I'd like to not call it a museum, it is just a place where the understanding that I have of a museum is that, as kids, we used to go to these museums, almost look at everything, get so overwhelmed by the amount of information that's available, and just can't wait to get out from there, right? So, which is why I don't particularly love that word for this project, but it is a recollection in the form of a museum. And then we also have prevention, and prevention again um, could be a word that can be questioned, because I mean, I did have questions for this during my final presentations as well, because the immediate question is, through architecture, how do you completely prevent? But I think the way in which I was putting this across was, it's almost a genocide research center which understands these situations, which understands the people who are going through the ramifications of all of these events, and then gives them, or collates like a, like a basis of information with which they can actually help themselves with. So that is the second part of the project, and the third is almost remembrance. And what I mean by remembrance is just of all of the events of matter. And the fourth one was this realization of empathy that I was talking about, through a landscape that talks of both the topographies of terror but also of hope, because both of these, that is hope as well as terror, is actually, I think, like the two sides of coin of this story, which is why I wanted to encapsulate that as well. Then coming down to how I actually went forward with the project was, it was really important for me to not just make this, again, like I said, just a museum sort of a project, and just then not have any discourses on tolerance. And how do you actually convince people to have, or to even at least think about having empathy for people who have gone through the situations? And so the realization of all of this was almost through a non-correlational, or partly correlational sort of um, a bystanding on this project, where you look at, like I mentioned, terror, but you also look at hope. So the two diagrams over here are actually talking about the same two things. So the first one is actually those war bunkers that you can see, and it's just a piece of dug up earth where people actually hid during the bombings during the war. And even to this day, even if you go back to the northern parts of Sri Lanka, even to this day, you can actually see these um, bunkers that are just left out in Jaffna. You can just walk into a neighborhood and you almost see these. I think I forgot to put in a picture of that. But yeah, even if you just Google it out, you can see these war bunkers that are actually just part of the everyday landscape in the urban landscape in northern Sri Lanka. And then you also talk about, how is it a stabilizing condition? Because when you talk about these episodes, it almost solidifies a very preoccupied notion of what ethnic cleansings or genocides there actually are. And then you also look at whether do you talk about the topographies of terror through your architecture, because then it would help people to understand the situation a little better. So this then is considered in four important points of consideration. One was the meaningless act of, trying to wipe out ethnic existences, right? Like, you can physically wipe out ethnic existences, but how do you actually eradicate memories of people, of history that these people were involved in, and also episodes that can relate directly to people's memory of their home. For example, if you are somebody who was in the northern parts of Jaffna and you weren't a Tamilian, you can still remember that most of your friends were Tamilians. So that is one. And then the next is just that structured conditioning of most of our society in terms of like political as well as cultural, that allow for for such episodes to even occur. Like, in terms of this, you could probably call it political, largely because of how the government dealt with it, and then how the people actually retaliated to it. So that is the second one. And then the third being just the alignment of almost all of these belief systems that lead to that very marginalization. And then it's that voided condition of your society, because you're trying to remove out a part of an ethnic existence, in this case the Tamilians in northern Sri Lanka. But how do you actually do that? But in doing so, there are parts of it that are voided out, and that then get left as stories or many different disconnections in that story itself. So the main point of my conceptual association for the project itself was these war bunkers. Again, like I said, all right, I do have the picture of it over here. So you can see that many of the ways in which they were used, even just children who were going to schools during the bombings, used to come out, used to run out of those schools, these smaller schools that are there in Vani, and actually hide in these war bunkers, which weren't even covered, like. So that is something that gets left behind, and that now acts as almost an active remnant of that societal condition back in the day. And I say back in the day, but it's actually just been 2009, so it's very recent of like a memory for most of these people. So for the project itself, to draw that parallel between what this critical memory of that event is, I almost used the formal language of that bunker as something that when repeated along a design grid, then allows for that memory to come back. And the types of memory that you're actually enforcing upon, or trying to ask people who maybe weren't involved in the situation to actually question, is how do the people feel during this, and how do you realize the constriction that these people felt in those spaces, because you can clearly see that there are a lot of people crunched into this small little space in the ground. And almost, so how do you give the liberating feeling at the very end of it, at almost a corner of it, and then as you progress to the center, how do you actually see the much more constriction and the claustrophobia almost that these people went through. So through that, you also look at the different components of the design. So I'm just going to run through this. So this is actually just some diagrams to explain the ideation of that museum that spatializes itself almost as an idea of that bunker in the ground. So this is an entirely subterranean space. And then there's also the research center that almost acts as these volumes that are rising out of the ground. And the association that it has is that most of these testimonials are the only ones as a connection that they have to this day with the people who went through this, because not a lot of written record or any of these, like how the Holocaust memorial or the Holocaust incident, sorry, is memorialized in the form of like very detailed writings. We don't have that for most of the genocides. So all these testimonials are almost what they have. So in like however written that testimonials that see the light of day is all that we have for this. So that's the research center that actually rises above the ground, and almost in a conjunction to how the museum is underneath and the research center above. And then the The third part being the remembrance that gives a form of advocacy to most of the unidentified and unlisted faces of war. Many of these testimonials also talk about how, let's say, it might be as simple as a woman trying to explain how her child is not enlisted in most of the lists that have the people who are missing from the situations of war. So that space actually tries to give advocacy to most of the unidentified faces. So that was one, and then the last one being both the narratives of terror as and turmoil as well as hope is then represented through this landscape above. And as you see here, it's the project was almost an urban insert, if you could call it that way, largely because of how it interacted with um, its context. So it's sitting right next to the Coom River in Chennai, and it's along the beach road, and it's almost at a conjunction of three different roads. So it's almost a space that is heavily utilized, and it's right next to the beaches of Chennai. So you do have a lot of people coming in over there, and above the ground, I did want it to be a much more seamless experience with how they interact with the river as well as how they interact with the edge of the side, because right now in Chennai, due to the it's not really upkept, most of these rivers, which is why you almost see many of these rivers being cut off from the city's experience. So this is one. And then, like I mentioned, the topographies of both terror as well as turmoil is almost represented through many different spaces or pauses of experience across the entire site and the project. And this is just a series of just the drawings for the project itself, trying to almost explain everything that I was talking about, being the landscape experience above and the museum that's subterranean. And it's to also shine light upon how the research center is an additional part to this program, because this is one thing that I actually found, quite interesting, is that whenever you do look at projects um, that have programs which are not very straightforward. In my case, it was a museum with a research center, so everybody's like, "What's the connection with that?" And my response to that was, one is to make sure that a person who visits this place, let's say as a first time visitor to the museum, then gets a chance to come back and not only maybe go through the exhibits again, but you also have the research center that then informs you of um, many of the, let's say, talks that you're having, or just to be part of the discourse on tolerance. That is what the research center was aimed for. So there is a portion of the research center which is semi-public in terms of like seminar halls and a public resource library that people can actually access. But also it has, of course, it's the much more private nature, and that's where the official standings of the research center would come in. And again, just a few more visuals just to show the experience of the project itself. And many natural elements like the forest, the water, that was a very important part of the entire story itself, because many of these people who were forced out of their homes weren't given a chance to just emigrate to any other country. You had to go through, many of the countries are obviously closing their borders to these people. So water was almost their only way of escape, because that's the only thing that doesn't give you a written record of where you're headed to. And you could, during 2004 almost, is when you saw like a large surplus of people who actually came into um, India, and especially Chennai and in Tamil Nadu, which is why you also see the largest number of refugee camps in Tamil Nadu itself. So which is why, and yeah, like I was mentioning, just these natural elements that are very essential to the part of the story is something that also inform the design itself. And yeah, just a few more spaces just to try to understand. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but many of the material choices for the project is something that I also wanted to talk about. It's uh, it's you can see that there are these two stark materials that are used, and one being the concrete in itself, which almost due to its brutalist nature, it allows to understand the somberness of the project, but also then softened out by the trees as well as the rammed earth bunkers. And very inverse to the way a bunker actually is, which is a part of the earth. Here they've almost risen above the ground, and the experience that you have with them is what informs many of you know the conversations that you can actually have about this project. So another thing about using earth is that they allow for the very earthiness of that material to be degraded over time, which is almost how the story has evolved. And just its direct association with people who are part of the story is something as natural and as seamless as that, which is why I even picked up that material. And yeah, just some other details for part of the project. And yeah, that is about it. I think that concludes the presentation.
Thank you for that. Great, wonderful project. I really enjoyed it. A lot of emotional connect to the entire narration and story as well. Uh, Also, contextually speaking, I think this was like a really beautiful urban insert, especially in Chennai. Uh, Also, while you were going through your project and through your narration, and also the context that you've chosen here, uh,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of reminded me of two projects in particular. I don't know if you have done a case study on this before, but I just wanted to bring those up. So I wanted to know if you also had a chance to see those projects. One was Moshe Safdie's Yad Vashem in Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and another one is Peter Eisenman's Berlin Memorial for the Murdered Jews in
Yeah.
Europe. Yeah. So those two projects are definitely really interesting, and they also try to capture the essence of a similar narrative that
Mhm.
was for the Jews. I
Right.
mean, this is for that. But what are your thoughts on those projects, and were those projects a part of your case study that did you have a chance to study those projects as well?
I mean, absolutely. This, especially the second one, is something that we have almost studied as part of our theory of architecture somewhere along the line, right? So that was one very interesting project, almost in terms of. At firstly, I'd really like to visit that project. Secondly, I think just how subtle it is in terms of addressing the undulations in the earth while you actually walk down those lanes, and it's a massive spread out acreage of site, right? So that is definitely one. But also the first one, I think the Safti is one in Yad Vashem. It wasn't part of my studies particularly, but just another thing that I've just really been interested in as a project. So I've actually studied that as part of for my sketching, because that's the complete other thing that I do just to understand these projects. But yeah, that was, but it's not a part of my thing. But there were other projects that are also just you know um, as a sense you could call it as a precedence for this project. But many of the projects that I also looked at, many of these projects that deal with genocides are largely uh, because of how well the Holocaust episode and condition is documented. It also becomes a direct narrative. And I think one really interesting comment that I received from one of the jurors, um, I can't remember I don't know if it was a competition or somewhere else, but that talked about how I think the one way in which I could separate my project from those is that the people who actually took forth the undertaking for the projects itself were Jews themselves. So it was very easy on like relational basis for them to understand, empathize, and almost give a narrative to the project. But
Mhm.
here I think, because I wasn't part of, I mean, I'm not a Tamilian brought up in Sri Lanka, or even just a Tamilian brought up in India. So I think it was very to say the least interesting for me to sort of understand how can I look at this as just an outsider. And which is why I think I dealt more on in terms of empathy,
Mhm.
because most of the things that you see in such cases is plain sympathy, and I think that's where the disconnect is from these situations.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. What were the projects which were the precedents that you were saying? Yeah.
One was Eisenman's Jewish memorial, and then there was also just not in terms of I did some of the case studies, but that were not case studies in terms of the direct program
Right. Yeah.
that is being addressed. I did some of the case studies, for example, just the Kala Kendra in like
Mm-hmm.
uh, Goa. So that's something. Most of these case studies that I did were to understand spaces and the relationship they have to emulate these emotions rather than to understand this. Then what else were? I think these two are the in-depth studies, but there were. mm of course, I did look at the Jewish Memorial, which is sorry, the Jewish Museum by Shumi, only because it was part of the reading that
Correct.
I was looking at. But again, like I try to stay a little away from these direct projects because you almost look at these projects and you get I think you don't allow yourself to form an immediate opinion. So in the beginning stages of my project, I did try to stay away. But Eisenman's I think was the only one that I was in like close contact with.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. I mean, the project and the context that you've chosen was part of the dark history of Sri Lanka,
Mm-hmm.
and also which was associated with Indians, Tamilians.
Mm-hmm.
This project actually kind of also resurfaces that again. It's almost been forgotten, but now this project in a way also kind of resurfaces that, and also an interesting way how to address and also to get closure also. Um,
Yeah.
and there are so many other instances in history which have been had a similar backing down. I wanted to know, like, what was the process like when you had to choose this particular project? How like this is, I feel, one of the most intangible things to articulate in particular, because it's there in your mind and then suddenly it materializes one day. But what was that striking point when you had to finalize on this project? How did this come about?
Mm-hmm. Uh, okay, so one very important thing that I actually wanted to tell and I forgot was that when I was even talking about this project being a possibility for my thesis itself, was or even this topic being a possibility for the thesis, I was faced a lot of pushback in
Mhm.
terms of how the plain statements that I were getting back is, as an architect, you cannot solve this
Hmm.
situation. You can't dwell upon social aspects of our cultural standing as a society itself, that you can't immediately provide answers. But my question was, do you really need to provide answers, or do you need to just make people remember, or and more than remember, do you need them to have a discourse on such things, because you're looking at prevention of such things, not just looking back and like forgetting. So that is, I think, one. And second of all, as just a designer, and especially after I've started practicing, so as just somebody who is just started taking steps in this industry, I find myself at like two odds. So one is I tend to be very I find myself to be holding myself more responsible in terms of my emotion towards design, but also as just in terms of a work culture, I'm much more. I can easily remove myself from that emotion. Okay, so yes, as a project, it was very important for me to have that connect with my project. So I did realize that as just any other student, we do have like our multiple options for our project before we take up one, right? So, but I think the main reason why I chose this was I'm looking at a 1.5 year span of this one project materializing itself. So I had to make sure that I was interested at the beginning,
Yeah.
because I found myself being in way too many situations where I'm not interested to do something and I just don't end up doing it,
Yeah.
which is why. So that was one. And another thing is, I think the amount of pushback that I received was what made me push to actually to take up the project. So
But I want to go a little back before even that. How did this
yeah. Okay.
idea even come about? So how can you
Ah,
yeah.
mm, I think I tried addressing this at the beginning of the presentation, where many of my classmates were actually finding good hold of their projects with just in terms of how they could relate. to the places that they're from, and they could immediately then decide, okay, I want to do this project back in my hometown. Or I think it's almost like a commonality for most of us as students, where we just find that immediate um, comfort that connect to like a place, and then we pick out things that we would want to or would like to see in our places, right? So that is one thing which made me then question, okay, then do I have a connect with my native, which I honestly don't. I do. It's as just as a Bangalorean, you get so comfortable in the city that you almost don't step out as much. Even if you try stepping out, you just cannot. Um, so yeah, so as just a person who's been in Bangalore from the time I was born, it was very hard for me to find that connect. I almost found it superficial for me to even force something into that, which is what led me into. There was one question one of my thesis mentors actually had posed, and they were like, so for a person who doesn't have a connect, who is in a city like us, could also be called an urban refugee, right? And that that almost sparked my interest in what is happening with people who are actually under refuge and almost throughout their lives and are in much more difficult situations of refuge than we find ourselves in. So I think that was like that first departure.
Hmm. Interesting.
So there was also there are also studies where I was trying to see then because you do have deadlines and you need to give a final answer saying,
Yeah.
okay, so this is the story that I've chosen and this is the one that I'm moving forth with. Many of the stories, like let's say the Israelis, the Palestinian Israelis, the Rohingya refugees, there are so many more ethnic cleansings than just the Jewish episode, not undermining its important in our history at all, and what it did to the people, and what people are still feeling like the ramifications of it. But also to just see these smaller narratives just around our own country. And I think as like an Asian subcontinent, and as a person who comes from Southeast Asia, we tend to almost forget most of the stories that are from here. So yeah, so I think that was what made me pick up this particular story.
Right. This project has been featured on quite a number of platforms by now. Also critically acclaimed. So I'm just curious, what was the biggest criticism that you got for this project?
Hmm. Okay, so this is actually something that I still am sort of going back and forth with in my head, not just in relation to this project, but also in terms of so when you talk about empathy, and you're trying to let's say take a person through a journey almost, which is in this case much more physical, because as architects that's how we're taught to put things forth. And when it's much more physical, it can also tend to be very suggestive. So it can tend to make a person more inclined, or it can also give some form of what would you call it? I'm not getting the word for it, but I guess bias, sort of a bias where you can just you know sway between the two sides. But I think the one thing that I struggled with, and as well something that is apparent even during most of my juries, is that when this particular question comes up, I think it's come up like twice now, where somebody asked me about, where do you step back as a designer to just let the space speak for itself, is what I'm still like, you know, having trouble with. But I think that's almost like a constant thing for us, even in terms of like any residential project. How much do you design to? Where do you stop? Where do you like stop yourself from over designing? So I think that was, I don't know if this is like exactly a criticism of sorts, but yeah, that was one of the things.
But if you look at your project, do you feel you have over designed at places?
Um, like I also just relate this to many of the other projects that I've done throughout my semesters, and I feel like I can like handpick out so many that I felt like I've over designed once I reach this, because over here, because you're in a much more almost like a magnified situation for this project when you're doing it, you can allow yourself the time to almost step back and think whether is this too much. But that's not the same, like it's not the same amount of time that I had with the other projects. So
Hmm.
I think those are the projects that I actually,
Hmm.
handpick out for that
Right.
particular question.
Right. Um, I'm just a little curious to know about the pedagogy at RV.
Mm-hmm.
So how are things structured? How is a thesis undertaken at RV, or what's the system like over there?
So we have actually prior to our batch, we actually just had an entire direct relation. That is, eighth semester used to be where you have your pre-thesis seminar, and then your ninth is where you directly just jump into thesis, and you just have that along with I think two other informal subjects.
Correct.
But for our batch, it was completely changed up, and it was first the ninth semester was our sorry, the eighth semester was our pre-thesis seminar, and then it was then followed by our internship semester, and then we have a thesis, which
Yeah.
is why it was like a 1.5 year range for me to stick to this one project.
But this was
And
because of the COVID pandemic.
no, actually, it wasn't. That is the
Okay.
case for our seniors,
Okay.
our juniors. But for us, it was just we also transitioned into a different university. We weren't a separate standing institution
Okay.
because we split from a larger university, which is RV College of Engineering, and we became a standalone architectural college,
So it's
which is
autonomous
why we
now.
had to go through. Sorry.
It's autonomous right now.
Yeah, no, it used to be autonomous. It's
Okay.
not autonomous. It wasn't autonomous for us. Now it's autonomous again after we
Okay.
left.
Okay.
So we were under another university, and which is why our timelines were sort of shifted, and that's why I was unfortunate to actually visit my site only like thrice, and I had no means to do so afterwards because just a month into our internship, it was the pandemic hit. So
Right.
sorry, a month into our thesis semester, the
But
pandemic hit, which is why it was just washed out. Yeah.
mhm. But did you see that as to help to have a 1.5 year span? Or did you have time to think about your thesis during your internship?
Absolutely, because you then get to have conversations with people who are completely
Ah,
outside your, academic circles. So
correct.
that
Right.
really helped.
Hmm.
And also you get to make more. I think you just allow yourself more time to make more informed decisions with respect to what you're addressing in your project, and to actually, frame your thesis question itself. Because most of the times your thesis will lay more emphasis on the actual, let's say, the question rather than the design, which
Hmm.
is why. But also one more thing that really helped was that it was really nice to have that period of time where you were out of your college, and then you came out into the real world into your internships, and
Yeah.
then you had a much more pragmatic outlook on things. So I think
Right.
that's what most.
Right. I wanted to ask during your design process, you're documenting a lot of your feelings or your thoughts. You're writing a lot. You're
Mm-hmm.
so and also sketching also a lot. But I just wanted to know is that for self content, or did you see that actually helping out in during the process, or how much did it help if it did?
Um, Okay, so I'm just going to preface this by saying, just like most of us, I tend to think a little more than necessary. So it was really, really nice to just sit and write things down.
Mhm.
Because one is you then get to understand what is your exact stance on things. So when somebody comes and questions you, it's almost like that elevator pitch that everybody asks for, right? Like they'll just be like, "Oh, so what's your thesis about?" And you're just like, left standing for like 5 seconds
Yeah.
understand how to answer this in a one line.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the helping bit really really helped me.
Uh,
And another thing is I really loved the fact that our thesis mentors were like really involved in most of our discussions that we had, where we used to have like even during the pandemic that didn't really stop us from most of the work that we were doing. And even though things shifted completely online, and you can also see that there are way lesser hand drawings for the project because of just the situation that we were in. And but still, that still did not stop us from having these conversations with our mentors, and that is probably the nicest. So when you're talking to somebody who will have a completely different stance on things than you would, it's really nice to have everything sort of written down, because then things just became clearer in your head, and while having these conversations with people, I could just articulate myself a lot better. And that's something that I promised myself that I would carry into my professional career, so I'm still doing it. Even to the smallest things that happen, I just journal things out as much as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because yeah, now that I think of it, it's really hard. People just come up to you randomly, what's your thesis project about, and you don't know what to
Yeah.
say. Do I say
Yeah.
and do? Yeah, so yeah, that's an interesting point that you've raised over there.
Mhm.
But I also wanted to ask what were the other kinds of processes that you took during your thesis process apart from writing, sketching? How did you sift through your literature? Because I asked this in particularly about when you do research, you kind of get overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. How do you sift through that, or how do you streamline that process? And because not necessarily everything that you come across or read really actually helps or informs your project, but how do you like curate your research work?
Mm. Okay, so one is I think I had to just brace myself for a lot of reading than what I was comfortable with back in the day.
Hmm.
And firstly, I had to convince myself to be open to any form of information that came to me from different aspects. So the four books that I actually placed out were not the only readings that I had. I had like minor readings with relation to actual architectural projects. I had sociological projects. Had psychological projects that were based on. So there's this really interesting reading by Naira Vikramsinghe. She has this entire she is a Sri Lankan by herself, and she has this large documented piece of writing which talks about the psychological impacts of the war on people. So again, like coming back to how do you streamline it is one, again, you're very in fine connection with what your thesis questioning actually is, and it's not something that you're wavering or you're even willing to waver from, because you are sticking to a tighter span of a timeline, because you just have 4.5 months to collate things out of the 4.5 months, where you probably just have about a month that you can spend on readings and writings before you actually move into the design. And as much as I'd like to have kept it as a linear process, it definitely was not. And I'm somebody who just I don't do that well with process that are not so linear, but I'm trying to become better at that. So that is something that I had to go back and forth on. And I think one thing that really helped me in streamlining the entire thing was, mm, of course, you start with a larger, array of things that you can know about the situation. Especially when you don't have the complete picture on things, you try to gather as much. So there was a point in time where I had to almost, stop myself from reading more and then get to actually interpreting it in my own understanding. So it couldn't be something that somebody else had a take on. It could not be something that was a formulated opinion which was probably even put out as a wording sort of a situation by somebody else that I could then take in, because I just didn't feel right about doing that. And then uh, and then you sort of just sit. For me, again, I'm going back to the writing bit, because I just felt like that is when I could really streamline my thoughts, understand whether the readings that I did were even helpful or not. Most of them turn out to be helpful. It's almost not like I can pinpoint at one thing that didn't inform something, because even as simple as reading a blog somewhere, and or even just listening to some you know recorded interview of a person who's going through the situation, which might not really directly inform your design as such, right? Like it does not, maybe I would say maybe doesn't inform architecture per se, but then it informs your stance on let's say the material that you're using, or even just the formal languages that you're adapting for your project. That is something that will help out. So I think that's where um, again I had a lot of help from my mentors to streamline my readings. It really just helps, to have somebody's outside point of view on things, and to not be too stuck with just what you're thinking about in a project, because you tend to get pigeonholed into this thought process. So I think, yeah, that is the only way in which I streamlined it.
Right. And did you get a chance to go back and read what you've wrote like multiple times, or was it just through for that process to happen? Or yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yeah. So one really main reason why I write is because the next day when I wake up, I might have a completely different stance on this. So I
Mm,
would go back, almost
right.
have a debate session with myself as to, okay, so if I'm thinking something new with relation to my project, then why am I thinking that? Is it something that directly informs it, or is it something that is pushing me away from what I'm actually trying to do? So writings really help in that situation. Even now, um, even in terms of the smallest discussions that I have with my team or my principal architects, it's really becomes helpful to just write things down, because because then even in the future, if maybe the person who's telling you things has a different stance on it, then you can cross check as to, is this what was intended or not.
Yeah. It's like a nice
So
logbook.
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. But interesting. But you since you said that, I wanted to ask, uh, is were there like any kinds of dead ends during the process that you went and you had to go back and reconfigure things? Do you feel
mm,
that you were heading in that and you had to step back a little bit? Because this tends to happen sometimes, because you're at the start you're a little bit ambiguous about where you're headed towards, and then you may or may not go in the right direction. So did you feel you were approaching a dead end at any point of time or during the process?
um there were two of those. If I
Mm.
like just thinking back on it, I think there were two of those. So one was, I was just so upset and obsessed about the fact that I could not visit the site again.
Mm.
And it was just a reality I had to just live with. Like,
Right.
I think that was just a very physical bottleneck, if you could call it that way.
Mm.
But it was just that, there are just so many points of connections that you can form when you're on site that you just tend to not have when you're sitting in front of a computer and you're almost not seeing most of the things. And I would have liked to really visit Bunny as well, but even getting permission to go to northern parts of Sri Lanka and very specific parts of the northern Sri Lankan peninsula, sorry, the island, it's very difficult. So that is one thing that I had to just live with. And secondly, because I've also seen um, many of my course mates who got a chance to. There was this one close friend of mine who had a project in Kashmir, and he had to do a lot of back and forth in trying to go to the place, which is also very secluded, but he eventually got to go, and his timing was just perfect so that he could time it just before the pandemic. So he just finished it and got back. But yeah, that was one definite thing that I was extremely frustrated with, and I just had to live with it, right? Like nothing more I could do. And the second was, mm, there was this time where, as students, when we look at projects for references, it almost so becomes an underlying intention that carries forth from that project, from the projects that you've read about. And it's so subconscious, and you try to, you in your head you're saying, no, there's a completely new stance or take on it, but it's almost similar to what you would have read in in your precedences. And I think that is where I had to actually stop myself from reading more into the projects, because some of these well documented projects have endless readings on their processes behind the architectural bit itself. So that, I think, was another place where I had to just step back, listen to the people around me saying, you're probably reading a little too into it, and then come back.
Mm.
And something that's associated with that is, just as a designer, how do you disassociate yourself for just a fraction of a second to understand maybe just something as pragmatic as some technical issue for the project, or at the end of the day, this is a subterranean space in Chennai, which is, you're looking at a climate and a temperature which is much harsh, and it's not as forgiving as places that I probably come from, like in Bangalore. So I also had to just look at does the story then deviate from what it's tending to achieve in a very contextual setting? Like at the end, I did have a juror who, was not, mm, I mean, like, respectfully so, like he was not so interested in the story. He just wanted to get through the, as like we have, some of our professors who are much more interested in just some of the finer technical aspects of the project. And I think in his head, he'd almost, made it, like voided this project out. He had negated it because his stance was that on he's like on let's say, in terms of like the climatic response of it, he was not too convinced. And even after having given him some of the amount of convincing for the project that I did take up, there were then questions about, does architecture again really solve anything that is as so socially um, you know placed as this? So his concerns were that. So you do, end up in situations where you just almost questioned with regards to your intentions of, are you telling a story or are you designing? So I think that was one major setback as such.
Right, right. But lovely project. Congratulations for doing such a wonderful
Thank
job.
you.
Neha as well is also in the process of submitting this project to many other platforms. So I have a good feeling I'm gonna keep seeing this every once in a while. But all the best for that as well.
Thank you so
But
much.
just before we conclude this, a couple of few more things. Neha is an amazing illustrator, so I just wanted to plug that in. You can check her Instagram page. If you guys are interested, you can also purchase reproductions of her artwork, or also you also give out originals as well.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so a beautiful and a wonderful collection. I think everyone should definitely go and check that out. But one
Thank you.
final thing, yeah, no problem. So one final thing, you're also just tell me a little bit about this thing that you're associated with, the Three Flaneurs. What is it
Right.
about? And if you can, we'll end it on that. So just let us,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure, sure. I think that was a great segue, by the way. So it is just my interest in, just as a student, I was really interested in going and visiting many of the projects that we, probably see. And as a generation, we're so much more connected to projects, maybe through Instagram or their websites or anything, right? So there were these two wonderful people called Sahil and Ekta, who I met while I visited Sri Lanka for the first time when I was actually there. And they are the ones who actually run Three Flaneurs, along with another person called Amrita. So they're again from Mumbai, who were just people who had a passion to travel and look at architecture and projects that were interesting, were doing new things, were also, just in terms of practice itself, what actually it then has manifested into. So it's a series where we do a few architecture opens across India, and also a few more architecture opens in other parts of the world, like in Dubai, because Sahil is also from there. So it was just an opportunity where I took it upon myself to be interested in this, to then go visit a few more projects. So we've had many architecture opens in Bangalore, in Mumbai, Delhi, um, Cochin. The latest one was in Calicut. So it's just a really nice experience to go and understand the realities of a project, right? Because you get to talk to these people who have gone through the entire process, probably have been in the field for a longer duration of time, a short duration of time, anything. So just to get these perspectives from these designers is also really interesting. And I think I think it's also a matter of interest where you also get to meet new people, sort of tend to share more journeys and stories about what you've gone through. And many of the people who come to these opens are also people who are not architects at all. They could be completely outside of our industry or maybe with the allied fields, but many people tend to come. And similarly, we also tend to we organize more trips to other parts of the countries, which are much more lengthier. So again, it's somewhere where it's a place where we almost go for a stretch of 1 or 2 weeks to different countries, and then we have many of these projects as, let's say, just as a student or even just the general populace, we can't actually go there because we don't have permission. So it's really nice that we get an opportunity to go to such projects. So that's not
Wonderful. So this is like you guys curate some trips to go to places and visit some buildings and also have an in-depth understanding of that
yeah,
place. Great.
yeah.
So
That's
when is
pretty much
the
how I met as well.
yeah? So when's the next open happening?
Once COVID relaxes a bit, like
Yeah.
right now, it's
Yeah.
almost like so impossible.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a lot of firms are just a little hesitant to even open up their
Right.
studios. So
Right.
there are some times where, I mean, there was this beautiful thing that happened, like just things that are very spontaneous that happen on these things. Is recently in Calicut when we'd gone, the project that we were supposed to look at was the Malabar headquarters by Stapati. And then, we had architect Tony Joseph just come in and talk to us about the project and just give us a walk around through the project along with his senior associate who's called Sujit. But both of these people, then, it was also lunchtime, so everybody was hungry. And he obviously could not provide food for that many of us. It was almost like 30 of us.
Yeah.
So, but he still invited us to his house, which is another project that we just got to see, just almost as like a bonus. So he just invited us for some juice and stuff like that. So things like this, right? Like just spontaneous things where, I mean, it's just a bonus for us because we get to see more projects. So, and one of the other, I think a very selfish reason as to why I go there is because I can then get to sketch on site. So that's
Yeah.
why I go. I accompany these two and all of their things that I can go to. But I think the next one, we haven't decided the location for it yet. But I think we were thinking of like a timeline somewhere close by, but because of the second strain, it's completely out, I think. So
Right.
yeah.
But anyway, for those who are interested, you can check out their Instagram handle at Three Flaneurs. Watch out for that space, and
Yeah.
quite maybe very soon you'll get to hear about more about the upcoming events. But on that note, thank you so much, Neha, for doing this. It has been an amazing time talking and seeing your presentation. Uh, but lovely, all the best, and thank you so much
Thank you for
for
having
doing
me.
this. It was my
Yes.
pleasure.